to 292, sequences. So in this last video for week 1, we're going to talk about what a sequence actually is. You did study these last year, but you looked at them in a slightly more specific format than what I'm going to do this year. To give you a definition to start, a sequence is a pattern of melody and or harmony that is repeated and transposed. So the transposed is the important part here. You can't just have a pattern that's repeated. If you're missing the transposition bit, it's just a repetition. It's not a sequence. This is a really typical example of a sequence that you would have studied last year in Music 191. This is called the descending fifth sequence or the circle of fifths sequence, depending what textbook you're looking at. And this is in the key of B flat major at present. Let's have a listen to this. So you'll notice looking at each of the 4 voices in this progression that they essentially repeat the same pattern over and over again. Our soprano, for example, repeats the same note twice before moving down a step and does that all the way through to the ending. Our bass goes down by 5th and then up by 4th and repeats that. Our tenor goes up by step and then down by 3rd and repeats that. And our alto goes up by step and down by 3rd as well, paralleling the tenor. And so these components were what made this thing a full sequence that you studied last year. In this course, we're actually going to break that down into its constituent components. And we're therefore going to expand our definition to include what I'm going to call melodic sequences in addition to harmonic sequences. So it's not just going to be the pattern of harmony, but it could just be the melody, for example, that's sequencing. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some examples of those different kinds of sequences. So I'm going to refer to 3 different sequence types in this class. There are more depending what textbook you're looking at or what sort of focus you're taking in the instruction. But for the purposes of second year harmony, the ones that make sense are melodic sequence, where we have a melody that is repeated and transposed, a harmonic sequence, where the interval between chord roots is repeated, thus transposing the progression, or what you've been doing in Music 191 so far, which is called a full sequence, where both the melody and the chord intervals are repeated and transposed. So basically a full sequence is a combination of a melodic and a harmonic sequence. Let's start by looking at the melodic sequence. The example I have on screen for you is from Mozart's Clarinet Concerto, first movement. This is the piano reduction, but the piece is for orchestra. Let's have a brief listen to this section of the piece. I've given you the chords here so that you can follow along and understand a little bit about how some of the patterns are happening here. Just a note about notation that's probably a little bit different than last year. The 5 with the arrows, last year you probably wrote as like 5/2 or 5/5. They mean the same thing, but this is the notation we're going to use this year for it. So in this example, we can see that there seems to be a chunk of melody that comes back and repeats, but as it repeats, it's shifted down each time. So we can see in bar 20, we have our reference pattern. That then gets repeated and shifted down a third in bar 21. And that same process occurs again, repeated and shifted down a third. And then we have a little tag that essentially leads us into the next stuff, which is why that version is a little bit shorter. It doesn't include the rest that the original did. So this is exactly a sequence. It takes a melody, it repeats it, and it transposes it. I'm not sure what you were told last year, but for the purposes of looking at sequences in this course, we're going to assume that any reference pattern plus 1 repetition is enough to establish the sequence. There's some argument in the theory universe about how many times something needs to sequence in order to be a sequence, but we're going to choose kind of the most basic definition here. I'm going to introduce some new terminology here for you on how we're going to label these things. The original reference melody, we're going to call the model. When that thing gets repeated and transposed, the next unit of that thing we're going to call the sequence. So that's the transposed repetition of the reference pattern. And we can have multiple sequence units. So for example, in bar 22, we see another sequence unit because it's, once again, transposing and repeating the same pattern. So watch out for that vocabulary. Model, sequence, sequence. This is how we're going to label it. We're going to use boxes or brackets to basically frame off what those patterns are that are getting repeated. This is a melodic sequence, but it's not a harmonic or a full sequence. It's not the same kind of sequence that you looked at last year. The The harmonic progression is not a sequence since it doesn't repeat and transpose. So for example, if you're taking a look at bar 20, you can see that the first interval in the bass is a third. But if you compare that to the analogous location in the first sequence repetition, that interval is actually a fifth on the downbeat of bar 21. And so that's a difference in the pattern. It means that pattern is not maintained in the bass and tenor voices. The sequence pattern only occurs in the melody line in the soprano. And that's why it's a melodic sequence, but not a harmonic or a full sequence. If it was a harmonic sequence, we would need to have repetition in the harmonic intervals. So what is a harmonic sequence? Well, a harmonic sequence occurs when the interval between chord roots is repeated, and that has the result of transposing the overall progression. So here's our sequence that we looked at in our original example, the one that's very similar to what you would have done in 191. We can see, for example, that our chord roots are moving down by fifth and then up by fourth. I want to switch this up a little bit though. So what I've just done, I made a slight modification to this progression, and I've added in some inversions. I've added in an inversion to the 4 chord, to the 6 chord, and then I've added a 7th onto the second last chord, onto the 5 chord. These inversions don't change the status of this thing as a harmonic sequence, because harmonic sequences refer to root motions. And I want to take an aside here just to clarify a little bit about that. So on the slide, I've listed in purple the chord roots for each of the harmonies there. And then below that, I'm indicating the motion between those chord roots. These could be understood slightly differently depending what octave you're looking at, but just for the sake of argument here, we're going to say that B flat to E flat is down a fifth, and then E flat to A is up a fourth. Notice that I'm not indicating quality. I'm not saying perfect fifth, diminished fourth, anything like that, simply because it doesn't matter in terms of sequences. Sequences can occur independent of whether that major, minor, perfect quality shifts or not. So this thing's a harmonic sequence because we've got a repetition in the relationship between those chord roots. The pattern of going down a fifth and then up a fourth is the thing that gets repeated. We can see that it happens 3 times in this progression. And as a result of that, the chords themselves get transposed. Essentially, every pair of chords moves down by step to become the next pair of chords. If you're a little bit confused about how this still constitutes the same sequence, I want to point out you need to be really, really careful not to mix up the concept of bass versus root. A bass note in a chord is the note that is the lowest voice of the chord. So it's a note in the lowest register. In our example that you're seeing on screen, in the first bar, C is our bass note. In the second bar, E is our bass note. So basically, we see that the bass changes depending on the inversion of the chord. The root note is the foundation note on which a chord is built or spelled. And that note will stay the same regardless of inversion. So in the 2 chords that I have on the page here, the root is always going to be C, whether it's in root position or whether it's in first inversion like we're seeing in the second bar, because this is the thing that the chord is built on. So in root position chords, the bass is the same as the root, but in inverted chords, the bass is not the same note as the root. So in our harmonic sequence, the inversion doesn't change what the chord root is, and we care about the pattern between chord roots specifically in determining that sequence. So inversion can actually be a really useful way in this situation to add some variety to your harmonic progressions. To change things, to maybe weaken or strengthen some of the progressions. Inverting chords, for example, will make them weaker than root position chords. And it can also help with your voice leading. If you want to not necessarily, for example, have a bass that leaps around so much, inversion can help you to add in step motion or third motion. So let's compare the 2 versions of this progression. The original one that's very similar to what you did in 191 is at the top. The modified version with the inversions is on the bottom half of the screen right now. So the top is what we call a full sequence because everything is repeated and transposed. All my melodies are sequences and my harmonic progression is a sequence as well. Whereas what we're seeing on the bottom with the inversions is only a harmonic sequence because the chord pattern is repeated and transposed, but the individual melodies and all the voices are not. So for example, in our soprano voice, you can see I've got repeated notes for 2 bars, but then notice at the ending that I don't have that repeated note anymore. I actually move instead of staying on the same pitch. Okay, so that breaks the idea that this thing could be a full sequence because not everything is sequencing. So again, full sequence is the combination of melodic and harmonic sequence. It's a harmonic sequence only if we're just talking about the pattern between the chord roots. So we're going to take a look at one final example just to see some of those differences between melodic sequence, harmonic sequence, and full sequence. This is our exact same Mozart clarinet concerto that we looked at a few minutes ago, but this is a slightly earlier section in the same piece. Let's have a listen. So I've given the chords for the section that I want to look at just so we can follow through this a little bit more efficiently. When we do the live classes, I'm going to expect you to analyze these chords on the spot just so you can get more practice at those. I have a few questions for you. So I've highlighted two sections in the piece, and I'd like to know, is this a melodic sequence? Does it meet our criteria for being a melodic sequence? Pause the video for a sec, take a look, and see what you think. So in this particular case, it turns out this is not a melodic sequence because we have some change to our melody pattern. If we're comparing our first highlighted bar to our second highlighted bar, you'll notice on beat 2 that in the first bar, the A is tied over, stays the same. But in the second bar, the E is not tied over and doesn't remain on an E. It actually shifts down to a D before continuing the pattern. So because there is that change, it's not quite a melodic sequence. It doesn't exactly repeat and then transpose the pattern. The repetition is faulty. Here's another one for you. Is this a melodic sequence? So in this case, it does qualify as a melodic sequence when we're looking at that shorter unit. Because in this case, the intervals are the same in each repetition, they're just transposed. So we have the pattern leap a third, down a step, down a step. That's exactly replicated in version 2, leap up a third, down a step, and in version 3, leap up a third, down a step, down a step. So melodic sequences can happen over different spans of time. Sometimes they're full bars or maybe even full phrases, but sometimes they just occur from one beat to the next. Next, I want you to take a look at the harmonic progression, and I want you to answer, is this a harmonic sequence? Does it repeat the pattern of chord roots? It turns out yes in this case, because the interval between chord roots is down a second each time. So from 1 to 7 is down a second, from 7 to 6 is down a second, and all the way through the highlighted progression. It turns out they're all in the same version, but that wouldn't have mattered. Even if these were in different inversions, it still would have constituted a harmonic sequence. All right, one more for you. In this particular case, since we're talking about both a melodic sequence and a harmonic sequence happening in the same region, everything is being transposed here and repeated. So this small section that I have now highlighted, this is a full sequence. So you'll see in real music, it actually phases in and out of using melodic sequences, harmonic sequences, and full sequences. It doesn't necessarily just stick to one or the other. You can have zones where you switch between the three types. All right, just a few points that I'd like to get to wrap up here. We talked about prolongation in the previous video when we talked about harmonic function, and I want to talk about how that links into sequences, because sequences do have a very particular effect on harmonic prolongation. Because sequences are more focused on duplicating a pattern than they are in producing tension and release, they suspend harmonic function. In other words, the harmonic function doesn't change even though the chords are changing. This means that we don't really perceive a change of harmonic function from chord to chord, but rather we hear the entire sequence as a zone of one particular harmonic function. Let's take a look at an example and you'll see what I mean. So in our Mozart example that we just looked at, what's going to happen here is that because our sequence starts with the one chord and it ends with the one chord, that's essentially a gigantic sandwich. And so we're going to hear that whole region as having tonic function. The chords are not moving in the typical way that they would with regular harmonic function. So for example, we would expect the 7 chord to resolve and resolve its leading tone, but that actually doesn't happen here because it doesn't need to in a sequence. A sequence is way more about the pattern and continuing the pattern than it is about underlying harmonic function. This has a very particular implication for working in minor keys. Because sequences suspend harmonic function, this means that in minor keys, we will not raise the leading tone while a harmonic sequence is ongoing. There are some exceptions to that, but we can understand this as a general rule. Here was your original circle of fifths sequence from the very beginning of this video. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to change its key signature to become B flat minor. And you'll notice a few differences that happen here. You notice, first of all, that the chord qualities are all different now. But you'll also notice that in some cases I raise the leading tone, but in other cases I don't raise the leading tone. So in B flat minor, your leading tone, your scale degree 7, is the note A. The note is normally flat according to the key signature, so to raise that, we would make that into a natural. That note A occurs in a few different chords here. It happens in the 7 chord, it happens in the 3 chord, and it happens in the 5 chord. In the 7 chord, we do not raise that note, since in this region, because a sequence is happening, harmonic function is suspended. Because of that, we don't hear this as a dominant function chord. It doesn't act as a dominant function chord, and it doesn't resolve like a dominant function chord. So if it's not acting like a dominant function chord, we do not raise the leading tone. You might remember that in the chord labeling video, I talked a little bit about that in terms of the 3 chord, and I talked about that also in the voice leading errors video. I said don't raise the leading tone in the 3 chord. This is the same reason in this case. It's not a dominant function chord, so we don't raise that note. You will notice, though, that in the 5 chord, towards the ending of the progression, that I did raise that leading tone. This is actually optional, depending how the sequence is going to fit in with the rest of the music. But if this was a sequence that was ending a piece, for example, I would want to raise that leading tone, because we're basically exiting out of the sequence at this point, and thus harmonic function resumes in the normal fashion. So we would hear that as a dominant function chord. We need that dominant function to create the cadence, so we would need to raise that leading tone to establish that dominant function. If this was a sequence somewhere else in the piece that was maybe beginning something, we wouldn't necessarily need to raise that leading tone, because maybe that tonic function would actually stretch over the full sequence. I will point out here that harmonic function within sequences, it can be a little bit ambiguous sometimes where it starts and where it ends. It's quite flexible, and it's going to be determined by features such as the rhythm of the music, the instrumentation, the time signature, etc. So we can't just make an absolute rule for it. It's going to depend on a lot of other factors in the music. One last note I'd like to talk about are sequence labels. In Music 191 and in the Strauss textbook, you were given labels such as descending thirds or ascending 6/7 sequences. I'm actually not going to ask you to use those labels this year. I have got kind of a personal beef with them because they're really inconsistent in terms of how they're named. For example, a descending third sequence doesn't actually involve 2 chords that move by third. There's another chord sandwiched in between them. Whereas a descending fifth sequence does involve a string of chords that all move by fifth. So you can't tell by the name of it exactly what intervals you're working with. Because we're more interested this year on the patterns of sequences, I'm instead going to ask you to identify the interval of sequencing. In other words, if I say +2 -5, what I'm saying is that the pattern goes up a second and then down a fifth. So basically that's going to indicate to us what is the repeating pattern. So if you see that sort of notation on an assignment, that just means follow these intervals, up 2, down 5. The angle brackets mean that the pattern gets repeated. And lastly, this year we're going to focus more often on the model sequence labeling that you saw earlier in this video. I care more about the fact that a pattern is established and that it gets sequenced than about the exact interval a lot of the time. I'm actually concerned in this class with the larger implications on how that affects harmonic function. So we're going to continue this discussion on perusal and in the live class. In particular, we're going to focus on analyzing sequence types and figuring out if they're melodic, harmonic, or full. I've got 2 examples that I'm going to present to you there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.